Hello, everyone. Sorry for the inconvenience for a few minutes. Today, we will have Q&A session for the Korean story. My name is Hyunjin An. I'm a TA for this course. Today, we'll be with Professor Byung-ju Kim. He's one of our preeminent course instructor and professor in KDI school. Today, we'll cover Module 3 and 4, which is Module 3 about accumulating human capital for sustainable development in Korea, and Module 4 about health policy and universal health coverage. If you've had any questions regarding these modules, please type in the chat room, and we'll try to answer as fully as possible. I would like to start off with the questions that was in the chat room just now. So, Devi, you asked about which SDG do you think is the most important for South Korea at present? Professor Kim, could you answer Devi's questions about which SDG do you think is the most important for South Korea's at present?
Are we talking about all different kinds of SDGs, or are we talking about any particular set of SDGs?
Yes, I think Devi's asking the broad aspect of the SDG that South Koreans care about at the present.
Can you say that again?
The question was, which SDG do you think is the most important for South Korea at this moment?
Yes. So which one are we talking about? Are we talking about from the entire pool of SDGs?
I think the broad aspect, yes.
Okay. There are so many different SDGs, and speaking for South Korea, I don't think anyone can do that. It really depends on whom you ask, and different people will have different answers to that. Those people who are in environmental area, they will say environment is the most important SDG for Korea. They'll say education. So I don't think it's a good idea for any person saying that this is what South Korea is the most important SDGs. That is my opinion.
Okay. And also, we will. There were some questions and discussion uploaded in our online discussion forum, and I'm starting with the Model 3 questions. So, one of the students concerned about the brain drain problem, although there is an implementation in education policy, how could the government or society address the brain drain problem in order to keep the human capital where there is a lack of educated people in developing country?
You're talking about developing country situation?
Yes. Would you have any ideas that how the country can address the brain drain problem?
Yes, indeed. Even though a country has a overall average low level of education, there will be some of the better educated people, and in order to avoid brain drain situation, policymakers will have to pay particular attention in making sure that the overall professional environment and where these relatively educated elites work have enough incentives for them to continue their lives in that particular country. It's a very challenging question, and Korea had difficulties with that during the 60s and 70s and perhaps into the 80s as well. And there were a lot of talks about China not meeting that conditions. And of course, we have had cases of India, for instance, where a considerable number of, very large number of highly educated elites actually having left the country as well. So this is a perennial question, very challenging question, and my answer would be, broadly speaking, very, very general. But the key is, if you want to make sure that highly educated top portion of your elite group stay in your country, of course, you have to pay attention in making sure that overall working environment and compensations and the systems where they are working in are adequately kind of improved and so on. So I guess that would be my answer to that very difficult question, but important question anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor, would you think of any Korean's case in brain circulation to address the brain problem?
Brain circulation, I don't understand. I'm sure you're not talking about blood circulation in the brain. What do you mean by
Oh,
brain circulation?
so I think, so as you said, as you mentioned, Korea successfully addressed the brain drain problem. And do you think of any kind of example in Korean's case that had successfully addressed the brain drain problem?
Okay, that's a good question. I guess one of the key example has to do with the school where I'm teaching, KDI school. Uh,
Mhm.
KDI school is a part of the large think tank, Korea Development Institute, KDI. And during the 70s, 80s, and well into 90s, and it's hard to say whether it's continuing days, but during those earlier days, Korean government made a made very serious efforts to ensure that highly educated people from overseas, at that time mostly economists, they would find a place to work at the KDI, find their professional home there. And at that time, under Park Chung-hee's leadership and the following presidents, including Chun Doo-hwan, the government offered quite an attractive pay package, together with other kind of incentive packages, to make sure that this best trained economists, often economists trained overseas, would come back to Korea and find their professional home here. And they set up a good example for doing that. So I think that's one case our foreign audience, for instance, would like to take a look
Mhm.
at. So that's one example I can think of.
Thank you very much, Professor Kim. Um, so I have the next questions here. The As of the Model 3, the country where there's lack of infrastructure and mechanism, vocational training may not be effectively work with lack of companies to work. How the government should infrastructure and mechanism as simultaneously. Was Korea's case in promoting industrial policy and educational policy exceptional, or can it be replicated in other country? I think because many students were wondering, can the Koreans experience be replicated in their country?
I'm really sorry. The internet connection had while you're repeating that long question. I'm really sorry to have to ask you to repeat the question.
Oh,
The
that's
essential
okay.
part of the question, not a long one, but make it short and then ask the question again. Internet problem.
Sure, sure. So how the government should set up the educational policy and infrastructure and mechanism as simultaneously. Could you think of any Korean's case in promoting industrial policy and educational policy? Do you think it's replicatable in other country as well?
Yes, I think paying attention to
Mhm.
both industrial policy and educational policy together is a critical one for any kind of countries. In the Western world, there is a particular perception about industrial policy as a possible cause for the unfair competition. I think there have been many studies that have come out to make sure that that's not the case. So industrial policy is simply a policy that pays attention to particular interest positions and so particular industries positions and so on. And so yes, indeed, any government should pay attention to industrial policy and educational policy together at the same time. Of course, industrial policy is more micro side, particularly addressing many particular industries, while educational policy is broadly kind of macro in the sense that it covers broad population in general. And so, yes, indeed, both sides needs and requires government's attention. But if government has a limited resource, one commonsensical thing would be for paying attention, greater to the educational side of it. Education policy side needs to be the top priority policy agenda for any kind of country. And I, Korea has set a very good example during the 50s and 60s when the country faced a lot of economic problems. When country was one of the poorest one in the world, Korea paid a very much high level attention to educational policy and achieved astonishing growth in terms of literacy and other common education attainment levels. So I think that experience of Korea paying top attention to educational policy first would be something that other countries try as well. And as countries gain and secure more resources, enough to pay attention to industry concerns and so on, of course, industrial policy can go together then, I guess.
Thank you, Professor Kim. There was greeting from Nepal, Karki. I think she asked about the questions, very broad questions. How can Korean experience help developing nation to reach SDG goals? I think we are getting to that questions with several focused questions.
Right, right.
But maybe
I,
which
I
yes.
to that question, hundreds and thousands different answers could be offered. But relating just that back to what we just talked about, education seems to be the most important one in terms of
Mhm.
Korea's experience. And so when you have general public that are better educated, then they know what to expect, and often they can demand government how to perform, and so therefore well educated to the extent possible, well educated public is a must condition, critical condition for securing development. So I guess a lot of colleagues of mine at KDI school and many of the people who have studied Korea's experience would argue that if we have to choose, education policy is the one, and then through that we want to make sure that people can read and understand issues, and often these issues are like collective action issues. What countries should do together, what kind of goals a country should seek, and all that. When you have that, that offers a firm, strong, critical, important foundation for democracy. And democracy, through democracy, people can choose their collective choice, and they can select their leadership, and then they select leadership that support the right policy directions and right directions of development. So having better informed and better educated people is the critical one, and I think Korea offers a good lesson for that.
Mhm. Thank you. Speaking of the leadership, Professor Kim, one of the students had the opinion. He lives in Ghana, and the leadership in Ghana, there was Dr. Guama. He understood the importance of the human capital, and he established the schools and medical school. However, he was overthrown when the leadership was changed. The government failed to continue his educational policy. In I know you're expert in the political issues, and in political terms, how can the educational policy be continued regardless of the leadership, and how can this can be continued? Do you
In
have any insight?
in democracies, people can collectively to make different kind of choices. Sometimes they get
Mhm.
disenchanted with particular the incumbent leadership, and they may ask for a different leadership in the next election. That's a natural thing for democracy, and that comes every time when we have elections for sure. So we have to take that as a reality. And in order to make sure that leadership, the educational policy, the direction of educational policy does not change as dramatically through the leadership changes, I guess there needs to be a collective efforts to depoliticize educational policy to the extent possible. I know it's very difficult in Korea's case, in the past several decades, we have gone through two different, not extremes, but two different directions. One was educational policy that emphasized on freedom of choice, letting people whatever they can do given economic resources. And on the other, there has been progressive educational policy and making sure that everybody starts from the same starting point in order to achieve better equality, and also to address the question of injustice in the form of when you have a well-to-do parents, your future will be better guaranteed through better education because you end up spending more money. That kind of situation needs to be fixed, the progressive belief, so they pursue that kind of direction. So in Korea, we have seen changes of directions in terms of education policy in that sense. But however, in terms of the need for increasing basic education, tertiary education, increasing the quality of education, and so on, I think there has been a consensus. And those areas of education policy have been rather depoliticized, meaning that the different governments, whether you're talking about progressive or conservative, they succeeded in generating a consensus or mainstream view about it. So in that regard, despite some of the switches of those starting point or freedom of choice issues, overall, I think Korea succeeded in maintaining the consistent, relatively speaking, and steady direction of education policy. So I guess that's one important lesson the world, the Korea, one important lesson Korea could share with the world.
Oh, very well noted. Thank you, Professor. Um, there are about 15 people are watching this live session. If you have any questions about this module, please ask in the chat room. I will ask one more questions about Model 3 and then we'll move to Model 4. So one of the students in the discussion forum asked about which policy was most important in improving human capital in Korea.
I think we have already touched upon that issue. That is education policy that has emphasis on general education, basic education, elementary education, and as a country's resource grows, making higher levels of education mandatory to the extent possible, so that people will have the basis based upon which they'll attend the schools and learn basic skills and the ability to digest and understand important issues for common interest. So I guess that is main goal, focusing on, first of all, at the very early stage, focusing on increasing literacy, and then after that, focusing on educating people in terms of having the basic economic skills for maintaining their livelihood, and after that, educating people with basic skills of understanding important political issues so that they will continue to act as the masters of their country. They will have a sense of ownership of the country. And those kind of efforts could be made by constant, I guess, endeavor to raise the bar for the required or what do you call it, the education that's required by the government for everybody. Korea started off with the elementary education being mandatory early stage, and then Korea moved to the middle school and high school and all that. So of course, different countries have different level of resources, so that kind of flexibility, but however, a firm commitment for moving up will be very necessary.
Thank you, Professor. There was another question from Devi. How did Korea choose to put public health on the political agenda back in the late 20th century? She was asking in the context of prioritizing health over law and order and security.
Right. First of all, to clarify, the public health as a whole, Korean government began paying very close attention from early on, from the 50s and 60s. It's not only 80s, and the Korean government made sure that the workforce will have adequate health, good enough to make sure that the productive uh, group of Koreans will continue to work at their different positions that they are assigned to. So, for example, deworming campaign, for instance, and then
Mhm.
nutrition side, Korean government paid a lot of attention to that. And since then, from the 1980s, Korean government side, government also paid a lot of attention to further improving the education policy to make sure that the people will get higher level of education and so on. And in doing so, they, I guess, succeeded in forming consensus in terms of what kind of educational attainment is necessary for the Korean workers and Korean people engaged in economic, activities and so on. So, uh, education has been an issue area where many Koreans have been paying very, very close attention, and the area has remained quite controversial and hotly debated. One of the key reasons why education policy area was highly debated had to do with Korean people's very exceptional, extraordinary level of attention to college entrance exam and its competition. So it's unfortunate. I mean, it has been overly emphasized, and a lot of people have felt very strongly about government policy towards the college education and so on. But I guess the flip side of it, good aspect of that is the aspect that shows that Korean people have long believed that higher education means better future for their children. So parents are very much committed to educating their children better so that they can have better future. So that has been some of the successes and failures of Korea's educational policy, I guess.
Mhm. I just had a quick questions. How could Korean people could develop those mindset to value the health and education would help us to develop?
Um,
Do you have?
right. I guess it's a kind of like common sensical thing, and
Mhm.
uh, basic human needs. You want to live healthy and you want to live better educated and better informed. So, in that
Mhm.
sense, Korea has long had a very active social consensus generating mechanism, such as a very proactive meeting. And through that, I think Koreans have widely shared what this country needs as a whole. So,
Mhm.
through that, I guess both health policy and education policy as one of the key essential issues. And I think that's where Korea has succeeded. I just
Mhm.
remember in answering this question, I just remember that I didn't fully answer the previous question about 1980s and health policy.
Okay.
After achieving basic health levels and health security, if you will, through the 60s and 70s, from the 80s, what happened was Korea decided to move up the ladder and become more of a welfare society where government ensured a higher level of welfare for the people. And in that welfare side, important dimension, of course, is a public health. And Korea undertook extensive study about how different countries have developed their health insurance system. And and Korea, in a way, kind of succeeded in coming up with its own design of making sure that the health insurance, national health insurance program will not make a similar mistakes as one of the things we have seen in the United States, for instance. Uh,
Mhm.
we didn't want to make health service too expensive and unaccessible to the general public. So Korean government has succeeded in designing a system where they could pretty much successfully control the price of medical services, but at the same time still encourage the provision of high quality medical services to the people. And those of you who are interested in this issue area, I guess I think you have your eyes on the very right target in terms of sharing Korea's lessons, and you should be able to find a lot of data and facts about how Korea's national health insurance has been developed for the past about 3-4 decades. So it's a very important policy area where many developing countries may find some valuable experiences. Korea can share with your particular country situations.
Mhm. Um, Karki from Nepal asked again. She said, "Thank you, Professor. How do Korea, as a global economy leader, see its role on global climate actions, while most developing nation loses its position due to lack of strong institution?"
I think
Would you have any? Yes.
Korea is in a similar situation right now.
Mhm.
Depending on which administration you're talking about, this current administration is still setting the direction and its commitment to climate change cooperation after about what a year and close to they're getting close to the second year time. I think this administration, this current government, still needs to uh, kind of articulate what its position is in terms of for the global climate cooperation. The previous administration had a lot of difficulties in defining its goal, and previous administration, the Park government, coincided with the Paris Agreement. At that time, there was a lot of pressure from Obama government of the United States asking Korea to have ambitious goals, and eventually, I guess the Park government of Korea went along with Obama government's demand, which I believe was a good thing. But there were many
Mhm.
details there were not finalized and set up properly. But with those liabilities and problems, we had a change of government, and this current
Mhm.
has particular energy policies, but with that, it has to still articulate its commitment to the climate change cooperation. The Korean government that has the strongest commitment to the climate cooperation altogether was, I guess, Lee government. 2 governments ago, I guess the government that was
Mhm.
in place in between the time of 2000 to 2012. Lee Myung-bak government, MB Lee government had the most comprehensive plan for climate change cooperation. But anyway, that's in the history, and still Korea needs to work out specific and important details about how it wants to commit itself to the climate change cooperation. I guess Korea, as you pointed out, uh, Korea as one of the world leading economies, it is important for Korea to have some solid, specific, and focused ideas about how it's going to, contribute to the global efforts of climate cooperation.
Great, thank you. Herbert, the student, asked, can primary healthcare be expanded in the rural areas where there are no or poor health infrastructure? And maybe you could give us some examples in Korea's case if possible.
Right. In Korea, we have universal coverage and it's very comprehensive and it
Mhm.
covers everybody no matter where you live. It's a
Mhm.
national health insurance program. And I believe Korea has largely succeeded in developing this very extensive and comprehensive the medical insurance program. So I strongly encourage you to look further into very detailed studies. I think there are several available including, I guess, from KD School knowledge sharing program as well. Uh, I forgot the name of KSA, I guess, Korean sharing
Mhm.
program. KSP, yes, KSP
Okay,
database. If you look into it, there will be a case about how Korea developed national health insurance, and you will find a lot
Mhm.
of valuable information there. And to summarize and repeat what you just said, regardless of where people live, whether rural areas or urban areas, we do have very comprehensive and extensive coverage of medical services through the national insurance.
great, thank you. Arnold asked, how can governments provide quality education in a context of low income? Should education be necessarily free in the early stages of development?
I guess
I don't know if this. Mhm.
when the resources are limited, there's a limit to which you can make all the education universal. I mean, free for everybody. In that case, what Korea did was we didn't necessarily make all education free during the early part of economic development. What the government did was they made it free for low-income families, but asked other families and higher up the level in the ladder of income distribution to pay for themselves. So I guess that's one of the ways. And as I said, during the 50s and 60s, Korea was in a very, very challenging economic situation. As you may know,
Mm,
1950s, for instance, at the beginning of 60s, Korea was one of the poorest countries on earth. Uh, Maybe
right.
three or five the most poorest countries on earth. Korea was one of them, and still the government undertook the policy of making basic elementary school education mandatory, requiring everybody to attend elementary schools and obtain basic education. And in doing so, as I said, they offer some help and assistance to the low-income family, but it depends on where you stand in the income ladder. So once again, limited resource doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot offer extensive uh, education service to the people by maybe making it mandatory and even making it not free of charge for the higher, relatively speaking, higher income people when the government does not have much of revenue. So once again, that such experience of Korea is something that can be shared with other developing economies of our time.
Mhm. Thank you, Professor. I was just throwing off the questions to you. But last but not least, I will ask the general broad questions and we'll just close with these questions. Which do you think the most important condition to implement healthcare service in developing countries? Also, the educational sector. Would it be infrastructure, financial aid, or leadership? Which one do you think the most important conditions?
I think on the education side, I have enough. I have made the points with you so far, so I don't want to repeat what I said on the educational side. Uh, so good enough with that. On the health side, I guess when a country does not have much resources in terms of sufficient government revenue and so on, I guess the government policy can at least require or demand adequate level of quality in terms of medical services being provided by the hospitals, so that people will have a trust in the services being offered by the hospitals. And with the limited resources, government can, rather than just offering national insurance program, which only happened, I guess, during the only 80s during the time of Korea. So I'm emphasizing national health insurance itself is not something that all countries should actually introduce right away or early on. Rather, they should make sure that the medical school education is being provided adequately so that you produce enough high quality medical staff. In Korea, when we had much of economic difficulties during the 50s and 60s, I think Korean government policy made sure that at least the medical schools, despite the lack of resources, made the medical schools educate the medical students adequately and offer them, sufficient education so that they will grow into a competent doctors and so on. So once again, I guess we are mixing education and medical service here together, but you gotta have well-educated medical doctors in order to have public trust in health service, so that people will go to the hospitals when they have problems and so on. But at the same time, also, I want to emphasize some of the deworming policies, the government policies addressing the question of parasite in human bodies and so on, that could actually critically uh, kind of damage overall labor productivity and so on. So I guess our KDI school has a KSP program, knowledge sharing program database, where we have a case study of how Korea undertook deworming policies and so on. I think they will be quite helpful. So government should focus on producing adequate level of education for future doctors, and at the same time pay attention to some of the critical public, such as deworming, sanitation, I guess the infant mortality and so on. So those are all basics, I guess. And that's all I can say at this point.
Thank you, Professor Kim. I think we'll wrap up at this moment because of time's up. Thank you all for your participating, and thank you very much, Professor Kim, for your thoughtful insight. And I hope we can continue to discuss more about it on the discussion forum online and for the next model as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you very much for your support here. And also, I like to express special thanks for those students who have joined us from overseas in many of the countries, various countries at this time, despite possibly time differences and so on. And I wanna express very special gratitude to your commitment and interest in this topic of Korea's sharing Korea's experience. And as our assistant has mentioned, if you have any questions, so at any kind of point, be very proactive and always feel confident about sending those questions through email or different mechanisms of our system here, and we'll be glad to do our very best to answer every single question with the utmost attention and commitment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Just keep watch for the next model, and he will be our next expert as well. So thank you, Professor Kim. We'll end up the live session here.
Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.
Thank you.